Good to see you this evening. We're in the middle of a series called King Solomon's Advice. King Solomon's Advice, that is material taken from King Solomon's book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And this is all put in order by Walter Porter, who was a professor of psychology at Harding University for many years. And he had a book called King Solomon's Advice. So I've distilled some of his ideas and organized the material in a way that at least is digestible to me. I think one of the difficulties, one of the challenges in studying the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, Solomon's material, is the fact that it is not as organized as I would necessarily need it to be for my digestion. But so what I need to do is I have to have it a little bit more organized. So this is organized in a fashion that at least I can understand it a little bit easier. And this lesson is about living righteously. Now next week, I believe it's next week, the lesson is number 6 in the series, is about sin and how sin works. We're going to give an expose of sin. What does sin do? How does sin work? That is, according to Solomon's advice, how does sin entrap men? How does it entrap women? And how does that occur? And what are the dangers of it? And how does he tell us to avoid it? So all that will be next week. But this week, looking at this one, living righteously, there are 3 different areas that we want to explore. Number 1, the fruits of righteousness. What are the fruits of living righteously? Then number 2, the qualities of those who live righteously before God. And then number 3, what are the hindrances to living right? What are some hindrances? And then we will not be able to cover all of them, but what are some of the hindrances that King Solomon mentions about living right, or to living right? So let's begin with number 1, the fruits of righteousness. That would be the fruits that come out of righteous, godly living. So first of all, there's a list here. But first of all, I would like for us to define what is righteousness. And righteousness is, of course, living right. But more specifically, it is living a godly life according to God's plan. Now, when I mention God's plan or God's plans, many people immediately think about, as the common phraseology goes, what is God's plan for my life? We hear people talking frequently, does God have a plan for my life? I'm not so certain the Bible talks about a specific individualized plan for each life, but only in the most generic sense. And that is that we would live right, live godly, and then the benefits will be there. So, for example, Paul will say this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 16 and 17 and 18. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and in everything give thanks. For this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. What is God's will for you? Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and in everything give thanks. Of course, obviously, living godly lives. But that's a very generic plan to live right, to live godly, as far as where to live, or where not to live, what job to take, what occupation to be involved in, what person to meet. In my mind, at least, I don't know that we have in the Bible specific plans, but God wants us to live just and godly lives. And that's righteousness, living godly lives. And then, of course, rejoicing always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. This is the will of Christ, the will of God for you. So think about several of them. We'll not look at every passage. All of them come from the book of Proverbs, so I only have the listing of the numbers, the chapters, and the verses. But all of them come from Proverbs. Or unless I have something different on the screen. Number 1, a long life. Long lives come about because people live godly. That is, of course, is not always the case, but this is a general rule of thumb. You have a long life. Number 2, he says, you have joy, you have happiness. I can remember well my mother telling me, my mother was Christian from the time she was 12. I was baptized when I was 12. I was brought up in the Lord's church. And she would comment after we would have perhaps gatherings and fellowships. She would say, how is it that people in the world do not see the great joy and the great happiness that we have in Christian gatherings? You cannot be happier than all of us gathering together in a Christian fellowship where there's no drinking except drinking tea. There's no drinking. There's no carousing. There's no ugly language. There's no men hitting on women. Nothing like that going on. No partying, but we have the best time. Sometimes I would bring visitors to a potluck or something such as we had earlier this month over next door. And people would go away and they would say, you know what? You all have the best time. I've never heard anybody having such a great time. I said, but we have no alcohol, no drinking, no cussing, no carousing, nothing like that going on. Just all good, clean fun. And that's the real joy in life. Good things. Good things mean material blessings. I want us to think about this for just a moment. Material blessings, according to 10 and 22 of Proverbs, come to those who live right. Material blessings is a blessing from God. I say that with emphasis because in our country, since the time of Woodrow Wilson, we've had the idea that those who have more material possessions somehow are bad people, or they have done what is wrong, or something is not right. And the graduated income tax actually speaks that way because it, of course, penalizes people who have a greater income more so than those who have a lesser income. And that graduated income tax, which was, of course, the brainchild of Karl Marx, actually speaks to people, telling them that if you have wealth, that somehow you've done wrong. That is absolutely foolishness. That is not right. Solomon tells us that wealth comes to those who live right and who live smart. And that's what Solomon has to say regarding wealth. Now, we do have a warning in the New Testament regarding the wealthy. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 19 and following. Charge them that are rich in this present world that they be not high-minded, nor have their hopes set on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. That is to say simply, there are dangers with wealth, but wealth itself is not sinful. In our country today, we have the very opposite type of thing that is preached almost on every hand. But Solomon tells us good things to enjoy come to those who live right and godly. Also, strength and favor. I mentioned last week regarding favor, strength and favor. Thomas Jefferson's idea about those who should serve in government. Remember the idea of natural aristocracy. Instead of what he called an artificial aristocracy, which was over the sea in England, those people who were born into the blue bloods were born into the kingdom. They're born into power, and those who were on the bottom could never come to the top. He said, we have in this country what he called a natural aristocracy, such as the cream rises in the milk to the top. And he said, that's what we have with people who live right and live godly lives. And those are the people, he said, we want to serve in government. The people who have godly lives and who have risen to the top by virtue of their own virtue. That is natural aristocracy, and that is the favor that we have with people. So also peace and safety. I want us to think about number 6, 7, and 8, all three of them here together. You notice peace and safety, then we have lasting security, and then delivering us from trouble. I taught school full-time, as I preached full-time, for about 22 years. And I taught in juvenile detention. And all of those, of course, are those young people who are in trouble. And there were people who were armed robbers, and some of them were murderers in the classroom. All of them were in drugs. All of them were in drive-by shootings and that kind of thing. And so I would always talk with them about God and about the Bible. I was really not to have the Bible in the classroom. It's a public school classroom. But I would have them come up to the front, and I would talk to them. I'd say, Sammy, I want you to come up here. I said, I want to ask you now. And I knew about the tapes. I would go to the control room. I'd know what the cases were. I said, tell me what's going on with you. We would talk about it. I would say, what God has to say. I want to point you in a different direction in life. Sometimes they would listen, sometimes they would not. So I would also have a class. It was a Constitution class. And they were required to sit in the classroom, and they watched the video. I'd have the video going, and then I would stop and talk about it, and they had to take notes. And if they didn't take notes, they were going back to the room. They were taken by the detention officers back to the room. So they all took notes, and they all paid attention. And they all wrote down exactly what I wanted them to write. I said, here's what, write this down. So this is how, and I was able to get in godly principles that way because the Constitution is filled with them. One day, there was a young man there. His name was Raymond Hernandez. Raymond Hernandez had come into my classroom. I had known him since junior high. Now he's in high school. And he had been shot in the chest with .38 caliber. And the bullet was behind his heart. And he was in his room recovering. Finally, one day, I said, what's going on with Raymond? I didn't go to his room. But when he finally came out to the classroom, I said, Raymond, I said, I'm really not to talk about their cases publicly at all. But I tried to talk real quietly. I said, Raymond, I said, how you doing? He said, I'm doing fine, Mr. Lockwood. I said, I understand you got shot by a .38 caliber. And he said, that's right. I said, well, and they can't get it out? He said, no. I said, do you know who shot you? He said, yeah. I said, well, he said he did. And the guy sitting next to him, he was sitting right next to him in the chair. I said, oh, okay. And he looked, and he heard me talking, so he looked over there. I said, he said, yeah. I said, okay. So, I said, let's look, Raymond. Later, I called Raymond up to the desk. I said, Raymond, I said, you're not going to live long this way. You need to live right. But they were in gang activity. They're involved in drive-by shootings. Even on the road there in Wichita Falls, they drive by. One young guy had his mother driving the car. He was hanging out the one of shooting at another gang member as he drove by. I said, those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. Now, we just preached to them. I said, please change your life. You're not going to have any security. You're not going to have any peace this way. One young man, he was a little bit resistant to what I had to say about these things. And he wrote on his folder, they'd turn a folder in every day. He wrote on his folder, live life with no, and he put it this way, live life with no regrets. I said, what? I called him up here and said, live life, what's this? Live life with no regrets. He said, yeah. He said, I just don't want to, he's trying to resist what I was having to say in class. I said, well, the only thing you're going to regret is that you don't learn how to spell. I said, live life with no regrets? That is not where we have you. But in juvenile detention, there's so many of these young people that are just trapped in that channel, and they could not see themselves clear to get out of it. I ran for county commissioner about 8 or 9 years ago, and as county commissioner, the county commissioner is in charge of the jail. So I go to the jail. They took me to the sheriff's department, took me to the jail. In every cage, they're big cages about the size of this room, or maybe twice the size of this room, and that's in every cage. I knew at least 1/4 of all the prisoners there. They came to the cage. Mr. Lockwood, he said, they're sending me off to Abilene. I said, I looked at one guy and said, Clay. I said, you didn't listen. I tried to tell you. He had a big scar now on his face, like this. I said, what happened to you? He said, well, I got in a fight in here. I got knifed. I said, Mr. Clay, I begged you to. He said, well, pray for me. I said, I pray for you, but I want you to get out of this, and I want you to live right and live godly. The point I'm making is that godly living leads to peace, security, lasting security, gives you safety, delivers you from trouble. But when you live on that side of the tracks, that is on the trouble side of the tracks, you're always going to have trouble. You're always going to have sorrow. Now, at the very last, Solomon tells us we will all have sorrow. We will not escape sorrow by living godly. Godly people have sorrow too. But it is not the repercussions necessarily of the seeds that we've sown. So we need to know some things regarding living righteously on that one. Number 2, let's think about the qualities of the righteous. What is the qualities of people who live godly living? What are those qualities? So there are several of them here. Let's think about them. Number 1, health. That is personal health and national health. I love these passages, Psalms 37 and 25 and 33 and 12. You recognize 33 and 12 as simply this, that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Walter Williams is a great columnist. He died about 2 or 3 years ago. Walter Williams pointed out there are a lot of godly people. They may not be necessarily, as we would put it, they would not necessarily be New Testament Christians. They're trying their best. They may be confused denominationally. They may be confused regarding the truth. That may be the case. But they're good, godly, living people. And do you know what happened? Walter Williams pointed out, he says, Americans give 3 times more than anybody else in charity. More than any nation on the face of the earth, Americans give 3 times as much. No socialized country gives what we give. But that is because we have people in this country who try to live godly lives. And that spells national health. It's the same thing with personal health. We have personal health. David says in Psalms chapter 37, he said, I've never seen his seed begging bread. God always takes care of his own. We have national and personal health if we live godly. Confidence. How about confidence? I cannot help but think of Nehemiah. Now, Proverbs 28:1 says it this way. The righteous are as bold as a what? As a lion. Bold as a lion. I cannot help but think of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes in 444 BC. Nehemiah, being the cupbearer, had an important position. The cupbearer meant simply not that he was simply giving a cup to the king, but that he actually vetted what was put in the cup so that no one would poison the king. But the requirement of the cupbearer, the ones who came into the king's presence, was that he always had a cheerful countenance, a cheerful attitude, disposition. Nehemiah received a message one day, the gates of Jerusalem are burned with fire, the walls broken down. And he said, I sat for a long time. He wept, he prayed, he was sorrowful about it. He said, God help me, give me an audience with this king. Because he knew he was going to go into the king and he was not going to have the countenance, the disposition that he ought to have. He goes into King Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes asks, why is your countenance so sad? I love this passage. Nehemiah says, I said a prayer. I said, how can a man be happy when Jerusalem, the walls are broken down, the gates are burned with fire? The tombs of my fathers are wrecked. How can I be cheerful in that case? King said, what do you want? Nehemiah said, another prayer. Here's what I want. I want you to give me permission to go back to Jerusalem. Think about how bold this is. Go back to Jerusalem, lead a contingent of people back there, build the walls of Jerusalem. And I want to have a key to the king's forest. The man who kept the king's forest, by the way, locked it down. He was called Lockwood. Lock the woods up. See, that's how it is. Lockwood. I want the key to the king's forest. I want to give it to Lockwood, and he's going to give me all the forest, all the timber I can give. Artaxerxes said, all right, go on. Now there's boldness, isn't it? He said, I want all the lumber you got. And he sent him on. Well, that righteous are as bold as a lion. And I love that passage, 28:1 of Proverbs. But the example of Nehemiah is so good. Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic priest who was breaking away from Catholicism. Martin Luther at one time, however, he didn't know which way to go all the time, but he knew this, that Germany was in an uproar because of the 95 theses that he had posted. You know the story. He posted the theses on the church door at Wittenberg, Germany. Nailed them up. 95. 95, that would be theses. That were 95 problems that he had with what was called the selling of indulgences. They would sell indulgence to sin. The Roman church did. They sold them. And if you had committed a particular crime, then you could have forgiveness through the priest if you paid money. Not only so, but you could pay in prospect for the year to come. And as St. Peter's Cathedral needed a dome on top of it, they needed more money, so the price of sin went up. And so John Tetzel was a legate for the Pope, and he came to Germany, and he said, as the coin of the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And that was the message they preached. Martin Luther had so many problems with this. By the way, did you know how he found the Bible in the library? He had become a Roman Catholic priest, had never seen a copy of the scriptures in his life. One day he was searching in the library and he found an old copy in the original language of the scriptures. He secreted it away, took it home and began to read it. By the light of his candle, he said, I don't recognize anything. These scriptures don't match anything that I know. And so he wrote the 95 Theses, posted them on door at Wittenberg, Germany, and now we have a firestorm all over Germany. Now, the reason I mention all of that is because so many people hated him as well as people loved him. One day he was standing outside the St. Augustine cloister, what was called a cloister. And he was standing alone, and it was getting dusk, and one man came up to him. The man had a dagger in his coat. He was going to exterminate Luther. And he came up to Luther and he said to him, are you not afraid to be out here by yourself? Luther looked at him and said, the Lord is my protector, the Lord is my shield. The man just walked away. I think, well, here's boldness. The righteous are as bold as a lion. And that's what we have when we are righteous, godly living. We can be bold. It's not only so, but we have freedom. Freedom comes, Galatians 5:1, speaking specifically about freedom from the law of Moses, but we have freedom. And the more freedom that we have, or I should say, the more godly that we live, the Lord gives us more freedom. We have freedom. That doesn't say that we don't have guardrails, that we don't have rules and regulations, but it is to say we have basic freedom in Christ, and God gives those to us. Not only do we have freedom, but we should have and we should foster good thoughts. Our speech should promote good. We should support others, and we should hate evil. And I put all those things together, and keep your heart, for out of it are all the issues of life. I put all those together because I want to mention one crime sin that occurs in our country so constantly, and that is pornography. Pornography is a crime sin in America. And I will say, unfortunately, it has invaded the pulpits also, even in the pulpits of the churches of Christ. It has invaded, and people do not know how, perhaps, even to avoid it. As a matter of fact, in Tupelo, Mississippi, a magazine is published by the AFA Journal. You're familiar with that one, AFA Journal. Don Wildman began the organization, American Family Association. And they put out a journal. His son, I think Tim, handles it today. But he had many psychological studies by different doctors in the magazine, and they talked consistently. This was 25 years ago. It's still same story today, that pornography actually rewires one's brain. It causes one to think differently. It causes you to act differently. As a matter of fact, some people even suggest this, that those who are caught up in entrapment in the net of pornography never can escape. Never. And some have suggested that. I think that is pretty frightening to think about. Well, the point of all of this is the following. We need to be careful about what we put into our minds, into our heart. Keep your heart with all the diligence. Out of it are the issues of life. It is so, so sad to see so many people caught up in the net of pornography. But that happens in our country so frequently, and everybody has access to it immediately with cell phones. Everybody has, don't we? We have access to it, and we have to be careful about it. So our speech should promote good. We should support others. We should hate evil, and we should keep our heart with all diligence. Out of it are the issues of life. There's a story of the meanest man in Texas. I may have told this not long ago, of Clyde Thompson. Clyde Thompson was on death row in Huntsville, Texas, for committing murder, several murders. He was only a teenager when he committed his first murder. This was before my time, so he didn't come through my classroom, but nevertheless, I had some in my classroom. But Clyde Thompson said, and he came out later and he became a gospel preacher, and here's how it happened. He was on death row. And while he was on death row, he heard a preacher of the gospel. I think it's P.D. Wilmoth. You know the name P.D. Wilmoth? Wilmoth in Dallas, Texas, had a radio program. This would be back in the 1930s and 40s. And he had a radio program, and he was listening to the radio, and the gospel preacher was preaching the gospel of Christ. Clyde Thompson said, I'd like to become a Christian. The governor, as providence would have it, stayed his execution, and he had time to become a Christian. He became a Christian. And not too long thereafter, even though he had committed several murders, he was able to come out, and he became a gospel preacher. It's amazing. He tells the story. He says, the hardest thing for me to overcome was my speech. He said, I could get rid of all the gambling. I could get rid of all the other things that I did. I could get rid of the wild women, drinking, carrying on drugs. I changed who I was with, but I could not hardly change my speech. And even in the pulpit, he said I had to really watch what I had to say, because it became such habitual that he would use bad language. And that's what happens when we get involved with not only pornography, bad language, and ugliness in the world. It just changes the way we think and the way we behave. So we need to be careful about what we do. And these are some of the ideas regarding the qualities of the righteous. But let's go on to the hindrances to righteousness. What are some hindrances to it? What are some hindrances to being righteous? Number one is prejudice. We have pride, lust, and riches. There are several others that could be on this list, maybe much more. Let's just mention 2 or 3 things. The first thing that is on the list is prejudice. But when we say prejudice, our mind immediately thinks in this country and in this time, in this climate, about racial prejudice. But that's really not the idea that I have in mind. I have in mind prejudice regarding ideas. I want you to think about this text in John chapter 12. And this is where Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 are quoted. John 12 tells us this, but speaking of our Lord, and this is the summary of his ministry. Chapter 12 finishes his personal ministry. Chapter 13 begins with the disciples only in the last week of his life. So, though he had done so many signs before them, this is verse 37, though he had done so many signs before them, yet they believed not on him, that the word of Isaiah might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who has believed our message, to whom has the arm of Jehovah been revealed. For this cause they could not believe, for that Isaiah said before, he has hardened their heart, he has blinded their eyes, lest haply they should understand, see with their eyes, understand with the heart, and should turn again, and I should heal them. Why did the Jews repudiate Christ? Prejudice. Not necessarily national prejudice, but it was prejudice. That is, religious ideas that they had locked into, that there would be a physical kingdom, that there would be a release from Roman tyranny, that they would have a millennial reign on the earth. The same thing, by the way, that is preached almost on every hand. That's what the Jews believed. Therefore, they could not believe a spiritual kingdom taught by a spiritual Messiah. And they would not believe it. They were prejudiced against the truth. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the prejudice has come about because of Satan. He has blinded the minds of the unbelieving that the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ should not dawn upon them. Many people have blinders over their eyes and over their hearts, put there by Satan. Their prejudgments, prejudices, their belief systems, their ideals, their ideas. This is what I believe. I had a Bible study in Wichita Falls with a couple, a good friend of mine and his wife. And when he came to the congregation, where I was, he had been in a Baptist church for many, many years. And I said, baptism is for the remission of sins. I told him what baptism is. She said, I know that. That's why I was baptized. I said, okay. That's the reason for which we're baptized. I have no problem with that. And it's not that I would be the one to make the assessment. I said, I think if that's why you're baptized, then I'm not going to say that's not good. After about a year, he said, you know what? I was not baptized for the correct reason. I've been preaching some first principles. He said, I wasn't baptized for the correct reason. And he was immersed into Christ. But here's the issue. His wife said, no, I'm not going to do it, because that would be saying that my mother, who grew up in a denominational church, is going to hell. I said, look, you say your mother was good and honest, a good and honest heart? She said, yes. I said, well, your mother did the best that she could do. And I'm not going to sit in judgment on her. And if she had a good and honest heart, she did what she thought was right, then God's going to handle her. But you know the truth. And you see that truth is baptism is for the remission of sins. If you don't obey the truth as you see it, then you're not as good and honest as your mother was. Your mother saw what she thought was the truth, and she obeyed it. But you see the truth and you're not going to obey it. So that's not as good and honest as your mother was. She said, I just can't. Her prejudice was so heavy, she could never be immersed in Christ, even though she knew the purpose of immersion. She could not do it. Many people have prejudices along those lines also. There are prejudices along other lines as well. Michael Walsh tells us in his book, he has a book called Last Stands, The Reason Why Men Die When All is Lost. One of the greatest books I've read. why men, he goes through all the last stands of all these throughout history, why men die when all is lost. But in it, he points out that the ancient Roman world, the Greek world, didn't have any concept of prejudices along racial lines. They didn't think about race. They recognized that people were of different races, but what they were concerned about was culture. The culture. They didn't want their culture deteriorating. And so the Romans wanted a culture to stay the same. So everybody was a Roman or a barbarian. That's how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 1. Romans and barbarians, Greeks and barbarians. That's how they thought about it. The idea is not that it was prejudice, but they didn't have any prejudice regarding races. But we think immediately when we see the word prejudice, we're talking about racial prejudice. No, there are many different causes for which blinders are put over our eyes. And some of those we've already talked about. Think about pride or lust or riches. We mentioned this already in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Riches, nothing wrong with being wealthy, but Solomon warns us, as does Paul. He says, when you're wealthy, be sure to remember this. Charge them that are rich in this present world, that they be not high-minded, nor have the hope set on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. That's what we need to be wary of always, even if we're wealthy or not wealthy. I had a professor at Harding University, Jimmy Allen. He said, you know, the rich man and the poor man can go to hell for the same reason. The love of the almighty dollar. You don't have to have a lot of dollars to go to hell for a dollar. You can love $1 just the same as you love $10 million, can't you? Surely you can. You can love $1, you can love $10 million. You don't have to have money to be caught in this kind of a trap. And that is loving money. I heard a young preacher, student say one time, he said, the Bible says that money's the root of all evil. Well, I said, whoa. The Bible doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money, not money. But he does give us warnings about it. So there are things that we need to think about regarding righteous, how to live righteously. What does it mean to live righteously? What are some of the benefits, the qualities of the righteous? And here we've looked at also some of the things that hinder us from living godly life. Next week, what we're going to see is how sin actually works. And Solomon describes it it's almost frightening the way he describes sin, that it entraps us, brings us down, doesn't let us out. So it's a good lesson for all people, young people as well as older people, such as myself. If you've not been faithful to the Lord, now's the time to make it right. We're going to stand and sing the invitation song. If you want to come to the front, we will pray with you and for you. Right now, while we stand and sing, led by Brother Stephen.